Our reading today from the publication The Century will center around the experience of a young man, a boy, really a child, and his family's presence at the flight of the Wright brothers in Ohio only a few weeks after their first flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And this is a first-person story about his experience and the people with him watching what we take for granted as an everyday event, planes flying in the air. But at this point in human history, it was a new event, an unbelievable event for many people. So we will read his experience. When I was growing up, we didn't have electricity. We used a lot of candles for light, and of course we had gas fixtures. And then, outside in the streets, we had street lamps. Every evening at sundown, the lamp boys would come around with their pole slung over their shoulders, and they would light the lamps one by one. All the little kids would rejoice when the lamp boys would come, because it meant we could still play outside, even though it was dark. We even had a few parades some nights after it got dark. We would build these lanterns out of old shoe boxes and candles. All the kids on my block would line up and parade down the street with these makeshift lanterns, while the parents and grandparents sat on the front porches and watched. My father, who was an architect with an office in downtown Dayton, Ohio, was designing and building a new house for us in the country, and it was to be fully equipped with electricity, which was pretty modern back then. There was just so much change going on in those early years of the century. I remember when we got our first telephone. You would have to stand at the wall and talk into this contraption, and we shared the line with 4 or 5 different neighbors who would all come on the line at the same time. Sometimes you didn't know who was talking to who. Still, it was all very exciting. Life was changing so much and so quickly that it made some people anxious. But not my father. He was extremely interested and excited by what was going on. One day he came home from work early and said, "Get your things ready. Our boys are going to try a flight today, and it may be the first one." My father always referred to the Wright brothers as our boys. He said, "We'll go out and see if it's successful. We'll be there to see it. It'll make history." Then he hitched our horse, Old Nip, and we headed out to Huffman Prairie, where the flight was to take place. We were good friends with the Wright family. Orville and Wilbur's niece, Yvonette, was my best friend as a child, and their bicycle shop was down the street from our home. Orville and Wilbur had always been interested in flying. I remember playing with Yvonette on the Wright's front porch while Orville and Wilbur sat at the other end watching the birds fly. And when they started working on their flying machine in the bicycle shop, the word spread pretty quickly around town. Some of the neighbors were pretty skeptical about what they were trying to do. They were always saying, "They're back in that bicycle shop again. I don't know what they think they're going to do. They will never make a machine that can fly." Now, being as close with the Wright family as we were, that kind of talk hurt us terribly. It was like our own family was being ridiculed. My father would always defend them. He would say, "You just let those boys go. Those boys know what they're doing. They weren't secretive about what they were doing. Their bicycle shop was open to anyone who wanted to come in and visit. The Wright brothers were so sold on building a flying machine that none of the negative talk bothered them at all. They just kept working. Our father had driven us out to Huffman Prairie a number of times. That's the place that Orville and Wilbur used as the testing ground. All the other times we were out there was no flying going on. They would just be testing their machine, working on the propeller or motorizing something or making it move here or there. But this time, my father had heard that they were actually going to make it fly. Now, the Wright brothers had already had a successful flight down in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, but none of the newspapers really reported on it, and most people didn't believe it actually happened. So as far as we were concerned, they were attempting the impossible that day. Dad knew of a place at Huffman Prairie that was on an incline, and it offered us a pretty good view of what was going on. Nip knew exactly where the place was too, because he had been there so many times before with my father. There was much activity going on down in that field, and we had the bird's eye view of it. Dad was so excited, he turned to us, shaking his fist, and said, "Are you all paying attention to this? Now listen to me. You're going to remember this to your last day." The horse kept getting agitated, and my father would have to get out of the surrey and rub Nip's nose and pat his head. He had to keep a tight hold on the horse's lines because the noise from the flying machine's motor was so terribly loud. The outer part of the field was crowded with people. We felt we had just about the best seat where we were. We may not have been as close as some people, but we could sit and look right down at everything that was happening. People applauded as they tested the motors, but for the most part, everyone was speechless. Every time either Orville or Wilbur did something, the crowd would inch a little closer to try and see what was going on. They were constantly trying to keep people from getting too close. I think everybody was a nervous wreck. When that plane took off the ground, I just can't describe how I felt. I think I held my breath the entire time, and I'm sure an awful lot of people said a prayer. It was spectacular, just unbelievable. That's all I can say. The plane lifted sort of level at first and then started to rise up. I don't know just how far they went. The whole flight couldn't have lasted longer than a minute, but it proved that it could be done. When the plane landed, the whole field just exploded with applause. And then it got strangely quiet. Nobody could believe what they had just seen. People stood around kind of dumbstruck. Everyone I looked at as we drove away had this blank, incredulous look on their faces. They were on their horses and in their carriages, and they were just shaking their heads. It was such a surprise. Not many people were even talking. I couldn't help but think about all of those mouthy people who said it would never happen. I was just exhausted when it was all over. It was like witnessing a miracle. I said to my father, "I know you can fly a kite, but how did they get that machine up like that?" And Dad said, "That I don't know. You'll just have to ask Orville and Wilbur." Well, There is a first-person experience, them telling you their story, watching this momentous historical event in all human history, describing it as they saw it. And a very good word choice, especially at the end of this experience here, where he was talking about how the people were just dumbfounded. They could not believe what they had seen. It is fascinating that something that we take for granted, something that is just normal in our 21st century, but in 1903, humans did not leave the earth in machines and fly. It was a new event, something that people thought was impossible, unbelievable, and yet now it is a reality. Well, I hope you enjoyed that experience from our publication, The Century. We will be doing another reading with more interesting experiences in the future.